The thunder of hoofbeats was all Faith Emerson could hear as the wagon jerked violently, sending her tumbling through the air before her body slammed against the unforgiving prairie soil. Pain exploded through her side as she rolled, her wedding dress catching on sagebrush and tearing while the dust cloud from the fleeing wagon obscured her vision. The wagon driver, a man hired to take her to her future husband in Silver Creek, never slowed down, either not noticing or not caring that his passenger had been thrown from the back of his vehicle. It was 1875, and Faith had traveled over 1,000 miles from Boston with dreams of a new life in Wyoming Territory. Now she lay sprawled on the ground, miles from anywhere, as the sun beat down mercilessly from above. "Help," she called out, her voice barely audible even to her own ears. The vastness of the plains swallowed her cry as completely as if she'd never spoken at all. Faith tried to stand but collapsed as pain shot through her ankle. Blood trickled from scrapes on her arms, and her carefully pinned blonde hair now fell in disarray around her shoulders. Her water canteen had fallen nearby, but her trunk with all her belongings was still on that disappearing wagon. Faith crawled to the canteen and took a small sip, knowing she needed to conserve every drop. The nearest town was at least 2 days' journey on foot, and that was if she could walk, which, given her injured ankle, seemed impossible. As the minutes stretched into an hour, the reality of her situation became increasingly dire. The prairie stretched endlessly in all directions, the tall grass waving in the breeze like an ocean of gold. Beautiful, but deadly to someone stranded without supplies. Faith felt tears well in her eyes but fought them back. Crying would only waste precious moisture. She thought of the letters she'd exchanged with Matthew Prescott, the man who'd advertised for a wife in the newspaper back east. He'd seemed kind in his writing, describing his ranch and promising a good life together. Now she wondered if she'd ever get to meet him at all. A distant movement caught Faith's eye, something dark against the horizon. At first, she thought it might be a buffalo or perhaps even a mirage brought on by the heat. But as it drew closer, she realized it was a rider on horseback. "Hello," Faith called, waving her arms desperately. "Please help me." The rider changed course, heading straight for her. As he approached, she could see he was a tall man astride a magnificent chestnut stallion. His face was partially hidden by the brim of his cowboy hat, but she could make out a strong jaw darkened by stubble. He reined his horse to a stop a few feet from her, and Faith found herself looking up at the most striking man she had ever seen. Intense blue eyes studied her from beneath his hat, taking in her torn dress, disheveled appearance, and obvious distress. "Madam," he said, his voice deep and resonant as he dismounted in one fluid motion, "seems like you've had some trouble." "I fell from the wagon," Faith explained, struggling to maintain her composure. "The driver didn't stop. I think my ankle might be broken." The cowboy knelt beside her, removing his hat to reveal thick dark hair that curled slightly at his collar. "Name's Kieran Elliot," he said, setting his hat aside as he gently examined her ankle. "I've got a cabin about half a day's ride from here. Can't leave you out in this sun." Faith winced as his fingers probed her injured ankle. "It doesn't appear broken, just a bad sprain," he concluded. "But you can't walk on it. I'll need to carry you." "Carry me?" Faith echoed, alarmed at the impropriety. "Sir, I don't even know you." A slight smile curved his lips. "Well, miss." Faith Emerson," she supplied. "Miss Emerson, I don't see much choice unless you prefer to wait for the next traveler, which might be days from now." His eyes softened. "I promise I'm no threat to you, I'm just offering help." Faith hesitated, but the throbbing pain in her ankle and the relentless sun convinced her. "Thank you, Mr. Elliot. I would be grateful for your assistance." Without further discussion, Kieran scooped her up in his arms as if she weighed nothing at all. Faith gasped at the sudden contact, finding herself pressed against his solid chest, the smell of leather, horses, and something uniquely male filling her nostrils. "What brings a lady like you out to these parts alone?" he asked as he settled her carefully on his horse before mounting behind her. Faith felt his chest against her back, his arms reaching around her to take the reins. The intimacy of the position made her cheeks flush. "I'm a mail-order bride," she admitted. "I'm supposed to meet my future husband in Silver Creek. Kieran's body tensed slightly. Silver Creek's a good 4-day ride from here, he said. And who might this lucky fella be? Matthew Prescott. He owns a cattle ranch there. There was a pause before Kieran replied, I know of Prescott, never met him myself. His tone was carefully neutral, revealing nothing of his thoughts. They rode in silence for a while, the rhythmic movement of the horse beneath them almost hypnotic. Despite her circumstances, Faith found herself relaxing against Kieran's solid presence. He held her securely, making sure she didn't jostle her injured ankle. How long have you been out here? Faith asked, trying to distract herself from both the pain and the awareness of his proximity. 10 years, Kieran answered. Came west after the war with nothing but my horse and the clothes on my back, built my place up from nothing. You fought in the Civil War. Yes, madam, Union side. Don't much like talking about those days. Faith nodded, understanding. Many men who'd survived the war carried scars both visible and hidden. I lost my father at Antietam, she offered quietly. That's part of why I came west. After Mother passed last year, there was nothing left for me in Boston. Kieran's arms seemed to tighten around her momentarily, a gesture of comfort perhaps. The West can be hard on people, especially women, he said, but it can also offer second chances. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, the temperature dropped and Faith shivered in her thin dress. Without a word, Kieran halted the horse long enough to remove his coat and drape it around her shoulders. The warmth of the garment and the lingering heat from his body enveloped her. Thank you, she murmured, pulling the coat closer around herself. We're about an hour from my place, he informed her. Can you hold on that long? We can stop and rest if you need to. I'm fine, Faith assured him, though her ankle throbbed mercilessly and her body ached from the fall and the hours of riding. The landscape changed gradually as they rode, the open plains giving way to more varied terrain with scattered cottonwood trees and a small creek winding through the valley. Finally, a modest cabin came into view, nestled against a backdrop of rolling hills. Smoke curled from the chimney, and a corral stood nearby with several horses grazing contentedly. Home, Kieran announced, bringing his horse to a stop in front of the cabin. It's not much, but it's solid. A young boy of perhaps 16 emerged from a small outbuilding, wiping his hands on a rag. Mr. Elliot, didn't expect you back so soon. He stopped short when he spotted Faith. Oh, I didn't realize you had company. Tommy, this is Miss Emerson, Kieran introduced as he dismounted and reached up to help Faith down. She had an accident on the trail. Miss Emerson, this is Tommy Watkins. He helps out around the place. Tommy nodded respectfully. Madam. Kieran lifted Faith into his arms again, carrying her toward the cabin. Tommy, could you fetch some clean water and bring it inside, and see to Russet if you would? Yes, sir, the boy replied, taking the reins of the chestnut stallion. The interior of the cabin was surprisingly neat and comfortable. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a cooking area nearby. A table with 4 chairs sat in the center of the main room, and Faith glimpsed a bedroom through a partially open door. Kieran set her gently in a cushioned chair near the fire. Let me take a better look at that ankle now we've got proper light. He knelt before her, carefully removing her boot and rolling down her stocking with surprisingly gentle hands. Faith blushed at the impropriety but realized the necessity of the situation. It's swelling badly, he observed, touching the discolored skin with careful fingers. I'll make a poultice for it. Should help with the pain and swelling. Tommy entered with a bucket of water and some clean cloths. Anything else you need, Mr. Elliot? Bring in the herbs from the shed, the ones Mrs. Patterson dried for me last fall, and we'll need to prepare the spare room for Miss Emerson. You have a spare room? Faith asked, surprised. Kieran nodded as he began cleaning the dirt from her scrapes and cuts. Tommy stays in the bunkhouse outside. I built the cabin with extra space, thinking. He trailed off, then shrugged. Just seemed prudent. Once her ankle was cleaned, wrapped in a poultice of herbs, and carefully bandaged, Kieran helped Faith to the small bedroom at the back of the cabin. It contained a simple bed with a patchwork quilt, a wooden chest, and a small table. You should rest, he told her. I'll prepare some supper. You must be hungry. Faith realized she hadn't eaten since morning. Yes, thank you, but Mr. Elliot, I'm concerned about Mr. Prescott. He'll be expecting me and when I don't arrive. Kieran paused in the doorway. Tommy can ride to Silver Creek tomorrow with a message. It's a long journey, but he's a capable rider. I don't want to impose, it's no imposition, he interrupted firmly. Your ankle needs at least a week of rest before you can travel again. Prescott will understand. After Kieran left, Faith sank back against the pillows, exhaustion washing over her. Despite her predicament, she felt safe for the first time since leaving Boston. There was something about Kieran Elliot that inspired confidence, a quiet strength and reliability that put her at ease. She must have dozed off because the next thing she knew, Kieran was gently shaking her awake. Supper's ready if you feel up to eating, he said. With his help, Faith hobbled to the table where a simple but appetizing meal of venison stew, cornbread, and coffee awaited. Tommy had already eaten and gone to the bunkhouse, leaving Faith and Kieran alone. This looks wonderful, Faith said sincerely as she tasted the stew. You're quite the cook, Mr. Elliot. A hint of a smile played around his mouth. Necessity teaches a man many things. And please call me Kieran. Mr. Elliot makes me feel like my father. Then you must call me Faith, she replied, feeling a strange flutter in her chest when he nodded agreement. As they ate, Faith found herself wanting to know more about this man who had rescued her. How did you come to settle in this particular spot? She asked. Kieran's eyes took on a distant look. Fought alongside a man named Daniel Harper during the war. He was from these parts. Before he died at Petersburg, he made me promise to look up his family. They had this land but were struggling after losing Daniel. I helped out for a while, then when old man Harper passed on, his widow sold me this parcel before moving back east to her sister. That was kind of you to help them, Kieran shrugged, just keeping a promise. And you've been alone here all this time, got Tommy about 3 years ago. Found him half-starved trying to steal one of my horses. Turns out he'd run away from a mean-spirited uncle who worked him like a slave. Decided he was better off here, Faith smiled. So you have a habit of rescuing strays. That earned her a full smile that transformed Kieran's serious face, creating crinkles around his eyes. Appears so. After supper, Kieran helped Faith back to her room, but she paused at the doorway. I never properly thanked you for saving my life today. If you hadn't come along when you did. No need for thanks, he said softly. Anyone would have done the same. Faith shook her head. No, not anyone. The wagon driver didn't even stop when I fell. Anger flashed briefly in Kieran's eyes. Some men don't deserve to be called men. Get some rest now. We'll send Tommy with that message in the morning. That night, Faith lay awake for a long time, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the prairie night. She thought about Matthew Prescott, the man she had agreed to marry based on a few polite letters. She had built up an image of him in her mind over the months of correspondence, but now she wondered how accurate that image might be. And then there was Kieran Elliot, a man she had known for less than a day, yet who had already shown her more kindness and consideration than many men she had known for years. It was confusing to feel such immediate trust in a stranger, especially in these wild territories where she had been warned repeatedly to be cautious. But something about Kieran's steady gaze and quiet strength told her she was safe with him. With that comforting thought, Faith finally drifted off to sleep. Morning brought the smell of coffee and bacon. Faith managed to dress herself in the torn and dusty wedding dress, the only clothing she had, before hobbling out to the main room. Kieran was at the stove, his back to her as he tended to breakfast. Good morning, Faith said, announcing her presence. He turned, and for a moment, something flickered in his eyes as he took in her appearance. Morning. How's the ankle feeling? Better, I think. Still painful, but the swelling seems to have gone down. Kieran nodded. The poultice helps. My mother taught me that recipe. She learned it from a Cherokee woman back in Tennessee. He gestured to a chair. Sit. Breakfast is almost ready. As Faith settled at the table, she noticed a piece of paper and pencil nearby. For the message to Mr. Prescott, she asked. Yes, Tommy will leave right after breakfast. Figured you'd want to write it yourself. Faith reached for the pencil but hesitated, unsure what to say. How did one explain to a future husband that she had been tossed from a wagon and rescued by another man? Would he believe her, Or would he think she had changed her mind about marrying him? Seeing her indecision, Kieran sat across from her. "Simple facts are best," he advised. "Tell him what happened, and that you'll arrive as soon as you're able to travel." Faith nodded and penned a brief note explaining her situation and assuring Matthew Prescott of her continued intention to honor their agreement. She tried not to think about why writing those words felt suddenly difficult. Tommy joined them for breakfast, and afterward, Kieran gave him detailed instructions for the journey to Silver Creek. "It'll take you 2 days to get there," he told the boy. "Stay the night in town, then head back. Should be home in 4 days if the weather holds." "Yes, sir," Tommy said, clearly proud to be entrusted with such an important mission. He tipped his hat to Faith. "Don't you worry, Miss Emerson, I'll make sure Mr. Prescott gets your message." After Tommy had ridden off, Kieran turned to Faith. "We should get you something else to wear. That dress has seen better days." Faith looked down at her torn and dirty wedding dress, embarrassed. "I'm afraid all my belongings were in my trunk on the wagon." "I might have something that could work until we can get you proper clothes," Kieran said, disappearing into his bedroom. He returned with a pair of trousers, a shirt, and suspenders, all clearly too large for her slender frame. "Not ideal, but cleaner than what you've got on." Faith accepted the clothing with a grateful smile. "Thank you, I'll make them work." The next few days fell into a surprisingly comfortable routine. Faith's ankle improved steadily with Kieran's herbal treatments, allowing her to move around the cabin more easily. She insisted on helping with cooking and other chores she could manage while seated, feeling a need to contribute rather than simply being a burden. Kieran spent mornings tending to his horses and cattle, but afternoons often found him inside the cabin with Faith. He taught her to play checkers, and they spent hours engaged in surprisingly competitive matches. Faith discovered that beneath Kieran's quiet exterior lay a sharp mind and occasional flashes of dry humor that made her laugh. On the third evening after Tommy's departure, they sat before the fire after supper. Faith had adapted Kieran's clothing with some basic sewing, rolling up the sleeves and pant legs and using a piece of rope as a belt. She felt far from proper, but there was a strange freedom in wearing trousers that she had never experienced in her corseted existence back east. "May I ask you something personal?" Faith ventured, looking up from the sock she was darning. Kieran raised an eyebrow. "You can ask." "Can't promise I'll answer. Why have you never married? A man with land, a home, surely there must have been opportunities." Kieran stared into the fire for so long that Faith thought he might not answer. Finally, he spoke softly. "There was someone once, Sarah was her name. We were to be married after the war." His jaw tightened. "She didn't wait. By the time I returned to Tennessee, she was Mrs. Jonathan Pierce, mother to his child." "I'm sorry," Faith said, understanding now why he had traveled so far west, away from painful memories. "It was for the best," Kieran replied, his voice neutral. "I wasn't the same man who left. War changes a person." He turned the conversation back to her. "What about you? Why choose to marry a stranger so far from home?" Faith set aside her darning. "After my mother died, I was alone. My father's sister offered to let me live with her family, but..." She hesitated. "My cousin Edgar made it clear his interest in me wasn't brotherly. When I refused his advances, my aunt suggested it might be best if I found somewhere else to live." Kieran's expression darkened. "And so you answered an advertisement for a mail-order bride." "It seemed like an opportunity for a fresh start," Faith admitted. Mr. Prescott's letters were kind and respectful. He described his ranch, said he was looking for a partner in life, someone to help build something lasting. It sounded hopeful, and now, are you still hopeful about this marriage? The question caught Faith off guard. Was she? The truth was, in the days she had spent with Kieran, her thoughts of Matthew Prescott had become increasingly vague and distant. "I gave my word," she said finally. "I'm not one to break a promise." Kieran nodded slowly but said nothing more. They sat in companionable silence as the fire crackled and night settled fully over the prairie. The next day, Faith's ankle felt strong enough to venture outside. Kieran offered his arm for support as they walked slowly around the yard. The sun was bright, the air crisp and clean in a way that Boston city air never was. "It's beautiful here," Faith said, taking in the panoramic view of rolling grassland stretching to distant bluffs. So open and free. That's what I love about it, Kieran agreed. Room to breathe, room to be yourself without anyone judging. They paused by the corral where his horses grazed. A beautiful mare with a white blaze approached the fence, nickering softly. "This is Daisy," Kieran said, stroking the horse's nose. "Gentlest mare I've ever known, perfect for someone learning to ride." Faith reached out tentatively to touch the mare's soft muzzle. "I've never ridden before. In Boston, ladies ride in carriages, not on horseback." Kieran smiled. "Can't get far out here without knowing how to ride." "Maybe once your ankle's fully healed, I could teach you." "I'd like that," Faith replied, realizing as she said it that she was already thinking beyond Tommy's return, beyond her eventual departure for Silver Creek. That evening, a sudden spring storm blew in from the west, bringing driving rain and gusting winds that rattled the cabin's windows. Faith helped Kieran secure shutters and bring in extra firewood before the worst of the downpour hit. Lightning flashed across the sky, followed by booming thunder that made her jump. "Storm like this could delay Tommy," Kieran observed as they settled before the fire. "The creek between here and Silver Creek floods easily after heavy rain." Faith nodded, feeling a confusing mixture of concern for Tommy's safety and relief at the possibility of a few more days at the cabin. "I hope he found shelter. Tommy's a smart boy. He knows not to take chances with weather like this." As the storm intensified, the cabin creaked and groaned around them. A particularly loud crack of thunder startled Faith so badly she dropped the cup of tea she was holding. Hot liquid splashed across the floor and onto her borrowed trousers. "I'm so sorry," she exclaimed, jumping up to fetch a cloth. "It's just water," Kieran assured her, rising to help. As they both bent to clean the spill, another thunderclap shook the cabin, and Faith instinctively reached out, her hand grasping Kieran's arm. She looked up to find his face inches from hers, his eyes reflecting the flickering firelight. For a breathless moment, neither moved. Faith was acutely aware of his proximity, of the warmth radiating from his body, of the subtle scent that she had come to associate with him, leather and pine and open air. "Faith," he whispered, her name a question on his lips. Before she could respond, a violent gust of wind slammed something against the side of the cabin, breaking the spell. Kieran stood quickly, moving to the window to check the source of the noise. "Branch broke off the cottonwood," he reported. "No damage to the cabin." Faith busied herself cleaning up the remaining spill, her heart racing from the moment they had shared. What was happening to her? She was promised to another man, yet here she was, having thoughts and feelings about Kieran Elliot that no engaged woman should have. The storm continued through the night, and by morning, a misty rain still fell. Kieran went out to check on his animals while Faith prepared breakfast, trying to sort through her confused emotions. When Kieran returned, soaked and muddy, he confirmed what he had suspected. "Creek's risen at least 4 feet. Tommy won't be crossing that for a day or two, even after the rain stops." Faith nodded, setting a plate of biscuits on the table. "Then we'll just have to be patient." The rain finally stopped by mid-afternoon, leaving behind a freshly washed world that sparkled in the emerging sunlight. Kieran suggested they walk out to see the swollen creek, and Faith agreed, eager for fresh air after being confined indoors by the storm. The normally docile creek had transformed into a rushing torrent, brown with silt and debris carried downstream. They stood on a small rise overlooking the churning water. "Nature reminds us how small we are sometimes," Kieran remarked. "All our plans and intentions can be washed away in an instant." Faith understood he wasn't just talking about the creek. "Mr. Elliot Kieran," she began, feeling she needed to address what had almost happened during the storm. "I want to thank you for your kindness to me these past days. But I should be clear that I have obligations to Mr. Prescott that I intend to honor." Kieran's expression remained unreadable as he gazed at the flooded creek. "Of course, I wouldn't expect otherwise from someone of your character." He turned to face her fully. "But I'd be lying if I said I hadn't come to care for you, Faith, more than I should, perhaps." The honest admission sent a thrill through her that she couldn't deny. "I care for you too," she confessed quietly, "but I gave my word to another man." A man you've never met, Kieran pointed out gently. A man who knows you only through letters. That doesn't change the fact that I made a promise. Kieran nodded slowly. I respect that, but I want you to know that if you ever change your mind, there's a place for you here. Not as a guest or someone I rescued, but as, he hesitated, as a partner, in every sense. Faith felt tears spring to her eyes at the sincerity in his voice. No man had ever spoken to her with such honest emotion before. Kieran, the sound of hoofbeats interrupted what she might have said. They turned to see two riders approaching from the direction of Silver Creek Tommy and a stranger on fine-looking horses. That's not possible, Kieran muttered. Tommy couldn't have crossed that creek today. As the riders drew closer, Tommy waved excitedly. The man beside him was tall and well-dressed, with a neat beard and spectacles perched on his nose. Mr. Elliot, Tommy called as they approached. Look who I found in Silver Creek. This here's Mr. Prescott himself. He was worried about Miss Emerson and insisted on coming back with me. We took the north route around the flooding. Faith felt as though the ground had dropped away beneath her feet. Matthew Prescott. Here, now, the riders dismounted and Matthew Prescott stepped forward, removing his hat. He was handsome in a conventional way, perhaps 5 or 6 years older than Faith. Miss Emerson, he inquired, his gaze moving from Faith to Kieran with obvious confusion, taking in her borrowed men's clothing and their proximity to each other. Mr. Prescott, Faith acknowledged, forcing herself to step forward. This is unexpected. When I received your message about the accident, I was naturally concerned, Prescott explained. I couldn't simply wait in Silver Creek not knowing if you were truly all right. He extended his hand to Kieran. Matthew Prescott, I understand I owe you a debt of gratitude for assisting my fiancée. Kieran shook the offered hand, his face betraying nothing of his feelings. Kieran Elliot, and there's no debt. I did what anyone would do. An awkward silence fell as the three adults stood regarding one another, Tommy shifting uncomfortably beside his horse. Well, Prescott finally said, I've brought a carriage. It's at the main road with my driver. If you're well enough to travel, Miss Emerson, we can depart for Silver Creek immediately. Faith felt panic rise in her chest. Everything was happening too quickly. My ankle, she began, is much improved, Kieran finished for her, his voice even. But perhaps not ready for a long journey just yet. Mr. Prescott, I'd be remiss if I didn't offer you hospitality for the night. You and your driver can rest here, and Miss Emerson can prepare for travel tomorrow. Prescott hesitated, clearly not thrilled with the suggestion but unable to refuse such a reasonable offer. That's very kind, thank you. The walk back to the cabin was tense, with Prescott offering his arm to Faith, which she felt obligated to accept. Kieran walked ahead with Tommy, his back straight and his stride purposeful. The evening that followed was one of the most uncomfortable of Faith's life. Prescott was unfailingly polite, thanking Kieran repeatedly for his assistance and inquiring about Faith's accident and recovery. But there was something rehearsed about his concern that struck Faith as insincere. When Prescott's driver joined them for the meal Kieran and Faith had prepared, the conversation turned to ranching. It became apparent that while Prescott owned a ranch, he employed others to do the actual work, preferring to focus on business dealings in town where he also owned the general store and had interests in the bank. Manual labor is best left to those suited for it, Prescott remarked casually. I find my talents are better applied to business matters. Faith saw Kieran's jaw tighten, but he said nothing, simply continuing to eat his meal. After dinner, Prescott asked to speak with Faith privately. They stepped outside onto the porch while Kieran and Tommy cleared the table inside. I must say, Miss Emerson, finding you dressed in men's clothing and apparently on quite familiar terms with Mr. Elliot was not what I expected, Prescott began, his tone carefully controlled. Faith bristled at the implied accusation. Mr. Elliot saved my life, Mr. Prescott. I had no other clothing after losing my trunk when I was thrown from the wagon. He and Tommy have been perfect gentlemen. Prescott nodded stiffly. Of course, I meant no offense. It's just that appearances can give rise to talk, and in a small community like Silver Creek, reputation is everything. I assure you, nothing improper has occurred, Faith stated firmly, though her conscience pricked at the memory of that moment by the fire during the storm. I'm glad to hear it. Tomorrow we'll return to Silver Creek and you can put this unfortunate incident behind you. I've arranged for the minister to be available on Saturday. I see no reason to delay our wedding now that you've arrived safely. Faith's heart sank at his matter-of-fact planning. Saturday, but that's only 4 days from now. Is there a problem? Prescott asked, a hint of steel entering his voice for the first time. I've already announced it to the townspeople. The delay caused by your accident has already been inconvenient enough. Inconvenient, Faith repeated, unable to keep the hurt from her voice. I apologize that nearly dying disrupted your schedule, Mr. Prescott. His expression softened immediately, and he took her hand. Forgive me, that was callous. I was simply worried about you, and perhaps it's made me less tactful than usual. Of course, we can postpone the wedding if you need more time to recover. But Faith had seen something in that brief moment of irritation, a glimpse behind the polite facade to the man beneath. And that man was nothing like the one who had written those thoughtful, patient letters. Who wrote to me? She asked suddenly. The letters I received from you, who actually wrote them? Prescott's eyes widened in surprise before he composed himself. What an odd question. I wrote them, of course. Did you? Faith pressed. Because the man who wrote those letters spoke of partnership and mutual respect. He described working alongside his wife to build something lasting. He didn't seem like someone who would consider a bride's injury an inconvenience. Prescott's face darkened. I don't care for your tone, Miss Emerson. Perhaps you should remember that I've paid for your passage west and have been waiting patiently for your arrival. Many women would be grateful for such an opportunity. An opportunity, Faith echoed. Is that all I am to you? An opportunity? The door to the cabin opened and Kieran stepped onto the porch. Everything all right out here? He asked, his gaze moving between them. Fine, thank you, Prescott replied tersely. Miss Emerson and I were just discussing our wedding plans. Kieran's eyes found Faith's, and she could see the question in them and something else, something that looked like hope. In that moment, Faith knew what she had to do. There won't be a wedding, Mr. Prescott, she said quietly but firmly. I'm sorry, but I can't marry you. Prescott stared at her in disbelief. What are you saying? After all the arrangements, after I came all this way to fetch you, I'm saying that I made a mistake, Faith interrupted. I agreed to marry a man whose letters showed kindness, patience, and respect. But I don't believe you wrote those letters, did you? Was it your sister, perhaps, or did you pay someone to write them for you? Prescott's silence was answer enough. I don't know you, Mr. Prescott, Faith continued, and what little I've seen today tells me that we would not suit. I release you from any obligation to me, and I hope you will do the same. Prescott's face flushed with anger. This is absurd. You have nowhere else to go, no means of support. And for what? Because I expressed frustration about a change in plans. He cast a suspicious glance at Kieran. Or is there another reason for this sudden change of heart? Before Faith could respond, Kieran spoke. Mr. Prescott, Miss Emerson has made her decision. I suggest you respect it. Prescott's eyes narrowed. I see how it is. Well, Miss Emerson, I hope you're prepared to live with the consequences of your choice. Don't expect to find welcome in Silver Creek after this. With that, he stormed back into the cabin. Faith let out a shaky breath, suddenly aware of what she had done. She had just rejected the security and stability she had traveled thousands of miles to find. But instead of fear, she felt a strange sense of relief. Kieran moved to stand beside her. Are you all right? He asked softly. Faith nodded. I think I am, for the first time in a long while. Did you mean what you said, about not marrying him? Yes, Faith replied with certainty. I couldn't marry a man who sees me as nothing more than a convenient addition to his life. I want what my parents had, a true partnership built on mutual respect and love. She looked up at Kieran, finding the courage to be completely honest. These past days with you have shown me what that might feel like. Kieran's expression softened, and he took her hands in his. When I found you on that prairie, I never imagined you would change my life, he said quietly. But you have, Faith. You've reminded me that there's more to living than just surviving. Inside the cabin, they could hear Prescott angrily gathering his belongings, but neither moved to go inside. This moment belonged to them alone. I meant what I said by the creek, Kieran continued. There's a place for you here if you want it. Not right away, I know you need time to be sure, but whenever you're ready. Faith felt tears of happiness spring to her eyes. I don't need time, she said. I know what I want. Standing on tiptoe, she pressed her lips gently to his. Kieran's arms encircled her waist, drawing her closer as he returned the kiss with a tenderness that made her heart soar. When they finally parted, both were smiling. What happens now? Faith asked. Now, Kieran replied, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear, we build something together. Day by day. The next morning, Matthew Prescott departed with his driver, his anger barely contained beneath a veneer of cold politeness. Faith returned his ring and offered to repay the cost of her passage once she was able, an offer he curtly accepted. As the dust from Prescott's carriage faded in the distance, Faith stood beside Kieran in the yard, her hand in his. Tommy grinned at them from where he was tending the horses, clearly approving of this new development. No regrets, Kieran asked softly. Faith shook her head. None. I came west looking for a new beginning, and I found it just not where I expected. 6 months later, on a perfect autumn day, Faith Emerson became Faith Elliot in a simple ceremony attended by their nearest neighbors and the friends they had made in the nearby settlement. She wore a dress of blue calico rather than white satin, and there was no elaborate reception, just a joyful gathering at their cabin where everyone shared food and good wishes. As the celebration continued around them, Kieran pulled his new wife aside for a private moment. Happy? He asked, his blue eyes warm with love. Happier than I ever imagined possible, Faith replied truthfully. Who would have thought being tossed from a wagon would turn out to be the luckiest moment of my life? Kieran chuckled. I thank God every day that I decided to ride that way that morning. He brushed a tender kiss against her lips. Welcome home, Mrs. Elliot. Faith smiled up at the man who had carried her across the plains to safety and into a love greater than she had ever dreamed possible. I am home, she whispered. I truly am.